to a much more serious matter. You wrote a piece in the Irish Times. Of course, you were in the middle of this when it happened 9 years ago. You wrote a piece for the Irish Times on Friday, which gave a factual account, and you've written a piece for the Mail on Sunday today that I think is a very brave piece, and is very critical, not just of Senator Norris's remarks, but of media responses to them.
Well, I think, Eamon, the story has shifted in the last week, very interestingly and very troublingly, really, from the point of view of the media, because it started off, obviously the story is, at its core, as a journalistic story, it is, what did David Norris say? What did he mean? What, does it all mean? Now, very quickly, this story, after Helen Lucy Burke intervened, the story became a trial of Helen Lucy Burke's motives.
Yes, let me first of all establish with you, John, you were consulted at the time by Helen Lucy Burke because she...
I was.
You tell us what she came to you and said.
Well, she called me. I was and asked for my advice. I didn't know that the Norris interview was in the works because it was commissioned by the actual editor. I was there more or less as a kind of an oversight capacity, but I wasn't directly involved day to day. But she wanted my advice, and she said that she'd done this very troubling interview with David Norris, who was a friend of hers. And there were some sections in it which she said were really, in her view, outrageous. And she had tried to talk him out of saying these things publicly, but he seemed to be quite intent upon doing so. And she'd even gone back to him and said, look, this looks very bad. It's going to get you into terrible trouble. Why, take this opportunity to clarify it or withdraw it or whatever. And she said, he just won't, listen to me, and I don't know what to do. And I said, well, she did. I asked them to read me out the quotations. And the quotations, to the best of my recollection, were pretty much identical to the ones that eventually arrived in the interview. And some of them have been in the public arena this week. Not all of them, interestingly.
The fact is that he was given a number of opportunities.
I said to Helen, okay, this is shocking. This will end his career, in my view. This is my view. It was a naive view, actually, Eamon. But I did think it would end his career if he said these things in public. And I said to Helen, please tell him I said this, and please tell him he has every opportunity now to... And she came back to me a few days later and said that, no, he wanted to go ahead with the interview. And I said, well, so be it. Now, you see, my presupposition was that the media would do their jobs. But of course, what I wasn't aware of was this kind of consensus, this omerta that exists in relation to certain people. And so there was almost no commentary whatsoever about this interview at the time, in fact. Well, Ireland on Sunday eventually picked it up and ran a story, at which point, which was at least a week after the publication of the interview, David Norris then began to say that he was misrepresented. Now, again, there's a kind of a sense around this week is that this was a big controversy 10 years ago. It actually wasn't a very big controversy. Only Ireland on Sunday, to my knowledge, did anything significant about it, and everybody else tried to brush it off the stage as quickly as possible. Now, it's been very interesting this week that almost everybody in the media, with a few exceptions, there was an excellent piece yesterday by Alison O'Connor in the Irish Independent, which I think is real journalism, a real journalistic exercise in this. But some of the newspapers, including I regret to say, my own newspaper, the Irish Times, has behaved disgracefully. The Irish Times ran an editorial during the week which said that this issue was effectively about a smear against gay people, that they were a danger to children. There is no suggestion whatsoever in any of this that homosexuals are a danger to children. What is at issue here is, what did David Norris mean when he said these things, and why did he say them?
Well, let me just for our listeners, information. First of all, I agree with you about the Irish Times editorial was one of the most disgraceful things I've ever read in an allegedly serious newspaper. Here's some things that were said. On child sexual abuse, Mr. Norris said, children in some instances are more damaged by the condemnation than they are by the experience. Asked if incest was acceptable, he said there was a case to ban it, but only for girls who might have an undesirable pregnancy.
Which implies him.
Also, just let me read the third one.
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Challenged on whether a child can give informed consent to sex, he said the law should take into account consent rather than age. He also said, and I want again to inform our listeners, he also said, talking about the question of paedophilia, and this is a quote from him, quote, "In my opinion, the teacher or Christian brother who puts his hand into a boy's pocket during a history lesson, that is one end of the spectrum. But then there is another." And then he goes on to talk about serious attacks on children. Now, there's these quotes are very troubling.
Very troubling, Eamon, but you see, what the public has been deprived of, this story really, Eamon, is about, if I go for president, Eamon, or you go for president, we can bet our bottom dollar that everything about it is going to be vented in public and discussed. And it's very unlikely that anything we ever said that was in any way problematic for us or controversial or anything will not be dragged out. That's what you expect when you run for public office. But it's very interesting this week that the newspapers, the liberal newspapers, have engaged, we can be sure if this was a hick politician or, God forbid, a priest or a Christian brother or anything like that who said such things, his arse would be toast by now. His arse would have been toast 10 years ago. Instead, we have, because the liberal newspapers want David Norris to become president, they have refused to do the job that they are mandated to do by the public. No newspaper, to the best of my knowledge, reproduced the relevant sections of this interview in its entirety. If they had, the Irish public would not be still voting to have David Norris for president. They would be looking for him to come out now and say, okay, David, fine.
Okay.
What did you actually mean when you said these things? In what precise sense were you misquoted? What are the exact words you would have said, to the best of your knowledge now, instead of the ones that were published? Because I can tell you, Eamon, that I actually sent that interview back to David Norris and told Helen Lucy Burke to ask him which of this, to check these quotes and say, was he happy for them to go into print?
Okay.
So there's no question that he was given every opportunity, if he was being misquoted, to say that he was.
Okay, John, if you just stay with us on the line for a moment. Robert Fisk, I know that you're only in the country a couple of days and probably reluctant to talk about this. Your response to what you've read and heard in this conversation?
If the quotes are true, if they're correct, I think that Norris probably has to talk about it and do so straightforwardly and publicly. We Brits have been trying to choose the leadership of Ireland for 800 years, and I'm not going to join that miserable train of people. But, I noticed that John, in his Friday piece, which I read on the plane from Paris, I do not recall the verbatim quotations. I also recall something to the effect that, and he said just now, to the best of my recollection, well, I think we need the tape recording, and I think that...
which Helen Lucy-Burke claims she can't find.
She can't find. Well, I think she should find it.
There, just to clarify that point, because what I was saying there was that, of course, I didn't have perfect recall of the words that Helen Lucy Burke read out to me on the phone. Nobody possibly could have, unless you had photographic memory or some such. So I didn't want to say that I remembered precisely the words and then quote them from the article and say this is what he said. But I certainly do remember the very, very, very broad thrust in relation to what is now called classic paedophilia. My goodness, what is this? What is classic paedophilia? Is this going to be a defence in court now? Can the Irish Times and the Irish Independent, all these other newspapers, come out tomorrow morning and explain to us what precisely classic paedophilia is, and in what sense it is preferable to the disgusting kind we've been talking about for 20 years?
Yeah, Siobhan O'Connell.
John, just at that time, after the interview was published, did David Norris ask for a retraction, a right of reply, or a correction?
None. Nothing whatsoever.
Okay.
Neither I nor the editor got any communication from him whatsoever.
Okay.